We live in a global and very hyper-connected world, and we are increasingly exposed to very complex phenomena. And to understand them and to deal with them, we need to manage large quantity of data. So without data, truly, we are unable to understand the world we live in. Our dignity, survival, and possibility of enjoying our rights and freedom are at stake today. As well, the pandemic in 2020 has been a clear proof of this. Climate change, migrations, energy crisis, poverty, all of those very important issues reinforce the need to think about resilience in architecture. My name is Elena Manferdini. I am the graduate program chair at SCI-Arc. It's clear, though, that humans are not at the center of the universe. We're part of a relational ecosystem with other human beings, with our biosphere, with the environment, with organizations, institutions, and so on. And so as architects, we need to start planning for this network of relationships or interconnections, not really accordingly to some bizarre Renaissance conception that sees the human being at the center of the perspective. And so resilience truly is an issue of sensitivity. We have very little to no sensitivity to these different qualities or quantities of data. And so as architects, we must prepare ourselves to come into contact with different alien, queer sensitivities, which must be translated into each other beyond usefulness. So this is the role of architecture, I think, and art today, to make these expressions and representation sensitive, that is, exposed to the senses and therefore generating sensation and meanings. This continuous process of translating data into cultural artifact of architecture is truly unparalleled in the entire history of the human being. Because of the amount of richness, quantity, diversity, variety, and ability to express culture, languages, places, times, custom, methods, and so on. When we think about resilience, first of all, as architects, we have to build up the idea of being sensible to all the complexity of data that make our complex environment today.
Hello, I'm Eric Ganoyu. I'm the head of research at SCI-Arc and a faculty member in history and theory. We undertake projects that range from kind of advanced issues in architectural fabrication over to questions of public policy on behalf of the public good. Most of that work has to do with affordable housing. Some of our current projects include research on the pending wave of evictions that's likely to create a huge new wave of homelessness in the city of Los Angeles and in many other cities across the country. We've been trying to find ways to gather data that just isn't available for policy institutes and legislators to be able to help inform the decisions that they have to make in order to keep a large new population of people from joining the ranks of the homeless. Another project that we're currently working on is collaboration with the community land trusts of Los Angeles to think about how to build a greater amount of affordable housing for the people of the city. We're working with people trying to start new transitional housing for single homeless mothers and their children outside of the city so that they can get back on their feet. We've worked on legislation to change land use in the city to make it a lot easier for market-driven development to accommodate the affordable housing that everyone agrees that we need. One of our projects on the fabrication side is the application of a new method of creating cross-laminated timber to create low-rise, kind of cost-effective, affordable housing units very quickly. A project to create beautiful and strange solid wood houses actually has real-world implications for the creating of more affordable housing in a place like Los Angeles. We are working with partners in surrounding municipalities and from our corporate friends, including Building Materials Corporation, to think about how we can bring these technologies to the marketplace to kind of make a real contribution to helping solve this problem. We're not just interested in affordable housing in Los Angeles. We have a track record of working with partners in Mexico, in Spain, and in India, around the world to see what the urban problems are in their backyard and what advanced kind of architectural research can do to help them solve this. So this is a question of nonprofit work, but it's also really a question of working with municipalities, companies, institutions on the ground in many different places to think about meaningful solutions to improve the way the built environment serves the people in those places.
I mean, working on the project brief of a tall building is particularly luxurious in the sense that it's a chance for architecture to really be in dialogue with the city at the scale of the urban. Those opportunities also put pressure on the building to give back, right? And so it's not actually just about the people who live in it and work in it, but it's about what it provides all the other people around it, who walk around it, who walk under it, who look at it out from their office windows. And I think that's a privilege and a burden to take on those kinds of projects. And I think that, you know, it's very difficult to make a tower interesting in my perspective. It's sort of like the housing problem. You know, how do you make housing interesting? You know, it's a challenge because it is about repetition. It is about sameness, and how do you get away from this sort of the floor and the slab and so on and so forth. We have such a burden on us to take heed of all the problems that the world is throwing at us, and maybe it's okay to be irreverent once in a while.
That's something that happened during the pandemic, is that we started to understand resilience as an act of invention. Need is a mother of all inventions, and I think resilience can be a subject of architectural invention. Architects have to engage with ethical practices that produce buildings that resist the powerful changes that we are facing. And also we have to come up with typological solutions that have the ability to change the status quo, that have the ability to surpass the issues that we're facing now. The system of values is part of the design studio that SCI-Arc has been conducting in fall 2020 as part of the Biennale of Seoul. And really the idea that one needs to give meaning in addition to comfort to the human condition. And to do this, both aesthetic and ethical principle need to be merged into the practice of what we do. And we understood ethic and aesthetic not to be in opposition, but to be coexistent, to be reinforcing one another. And so the students' work during the fall 2020 tried to showcase, first of all, the student creativity, I think, while at the same time taking their energy and provocations out of the academic context and sharing them with a larger public.
The antithesis standardization of urban relationships where plinth is dominating and closed off from the city's inhabitants. Towers where developers hold all power and masses dominated by the need to fill and expand rapidly for maximum profit fill the city. À côté d'eux seeks to challenge this dynamic by placing mass and void side by side in the sky, expanding the open ground as plinths, and reducing towering skyline heights that no longer reflect the needs of a global population.
If you go into our building diagrams, you can see that we've kind of halved the height of the US Bank Tower and increased it horizontally, which kind of gets rid of that abandon of the tall towers typology, which has fallen declasse during the recent pandemic.
Since these cores are placed beneath the actual interior of the tower, it results in the abolishment of the formal lobby, an outdated symbol of class, capital class in bygone society, unnecessary in today's day and age.
Rethinking height is a way to challenge ourselves to invert and subvert the exclusive notion of the tower typologies, crowning glory as its literal crown. To create may not mean to destroy, and a ghost of the past may also be the life within the present.
The studio was called Rethinking Height. The goal of the class was to broaden the students' intellectual and critical understanding of what political role architecture can and should have today in society. And in particular, the studio took a specific typology, the one of the high-rise, to discuss our role as architects in the age of the coronavirus or even the post-pandemic, when tall buildings developments are rapidly dropping in value. Historically, skyscrapers, one of the Americans' greatest contribution probably to architecture, have been the solution to the practical problem of how make the best use of land from the point of view of real estate. And for decades, major companies have spent heavily on these prized office buildings in the major cities. However, today, looking at Los Angeles, over 20% of downtown LA high-rise office buildings are vacant. And so shrinking their office footprint, those real estate costs can go down, in some cases dramatically. We took one example of the decline of the office typology in Los Angeles, which is the US Bank Tower designed by Henry Cobb in downtown Los Angeles that was sold to Silverstein Properties for a fraction of its value. And so we asked the students to really try to make a proposal, the typological proposal, that would try to reconciliate the powerful forces and very opposite forces also that architects usually have to deal with. On one end, the need of high-density buildings in fast-paced growing cities, but on the other end, also the well-known impoverishment of the public realm, what happens on the streets separating the plinth and the towers, what happens to public circulation when you build this kind of buildings, and what happens in the pandemic to these buildings. Contrary to this never-ending global race to build the tallest skyscraper in the world, the students argued that high-rise typology needs to drop. And so the studio approach to towers goes much beyond the trait of being rhetorical, which I think is almost inescapable quality of high-rise buildings, to be somehow an advertisement for themselves. And the class tried to think about how can we challenge this ubiquitous norm of putting a fancy hat on top of tall buildings while surrendering to the hegemony of the internal systems. More importantly than occupying a skyline, tall buildings actually need to invest in the way in which they hit the ground, which is really where their civic role needs to manifest itself. And so we're thinking about new mobility, vibrant civic spaces at the bottom of the tower, planning for safe circulation, and really considering the facade rather than the top of the building, the place of design in terms of relationship with the public and the public imagination. And truly this position was grounded in the studio belief that architecture is contingent to its physical context. And ultimately, today, tall buildings are responsible to the ground much more than they are responsible to the sky.
Downtown Los Angeles presents itself to us as a manifestation of the capitalistic tendencies that have driven our society up until now. with profit and productivity as king, and the tower as its crowning glory. The act of retrofitting the US Bank Tower is our attempt to capture what it means to live in a future that's already happening now.
The gesture of extracting and creating a new shell from the tower's iconic facade presents new spatial and surface potential with the existing building. Additional floor area is created through extensions and proposed as green voids, community spaces, or both. Modularity is introduced into the existing open floor plans. This allows for flexible and layered program making within the tower, bringing an end to the monolithic office tower.
This new circulation diagram, which implies also a typological transformation of how the tower works, right? So it happens on the ground floor and on the plinth with these loops, right? And then with this new elevator system that you are proposing. I think in the plan, the section and the kind of three-dimensional organization of the tower, you're actually very, very, very radical and very, you're pushing it to the limits, right? It's an incredibly difficult project to do anyway, right? To imagine introducing an entirely new circulation diagram in a high-rise building.
I almost imagine, rather than we think of the typical tower having a single owner or a kind of corporate body ownership. Mm-hmm. But what if the tower were, what if you could go in and you could buy a slice of land or a slice of area? And the outcome of that would be quite different in terms of the ability of the individual to manage their own space, but also kind of maybe redress what's on the outside internally. And then I think you're kind of imagining a completely new, both not just expression, but public interaction. And so it makes me think of, again, a kind of approach to individual ownership that could really kind of reposition what the tower type is. For me, that's really fascinating.
The second task for the students was to develop and rethink the idea of refuge. The idea of refuge today enjoys renewed relevance, not only in regards to COVID-19, the pandemic, but also larger context of population fleeing military conflicts, the relationship between nature and cities. So the refuge really is the origin of architecture, and rethinking what a refuge is encapsulate somehow conceptual framework for a larger proposal. So it's truly the technical and case study underpinning for something that could be developed at a larger scale.
Jesse's refuge looked at the idea of a seed vault, but also the idea that every person within a city context would have access to a garden. So her project takes the idea of above and below and works with the above, working with that top garden space that is a triple story space, and introduces a sort of interactive garden space that works with hydroponics to allow a sort of interactive garden for the city's inhabitants. And my refuge hideout occupies the plinth with a series of anechoic chambers that can be used, as we're all working from home now with probably a roommate or two. We all need to escape at points, and inhabitants of this tower, whether office or residential, can go into these spaces and inhabit the plinth in isolation in a different kind of way, in silence, in a city context that is dense and loud, and at points taxing, even when refuge, traditionally the home space, has been compromised given the conditions of COVID.
Some people think of a refuge or freedom as having space to do peaceful protests. And so I think the ground floor space below your plinth could be thought about as more of a space of the city. And rather than a place for people to go and be quiet, it's more of a place for people to actually communicate and be together and have peaceful protests or what have you.
In the uncertainty of the current situation, this project's doubling of the towers is seen as an alternative to the recent trends in upward growth. The once tall monolith of the US Bank Tower is divided into several low masses that retain the square footage of the overall tower. This project attempts to rethink height through access, emphasis on the plinth, proximity to public or outdoor space, and the consolidation of program into small individualized blocks. And so this one represents different moments found in nature, some real, some imagined. Context list, they remind us of our unknown position in a world full of mysteries.
That, you know, we can think about moments like extreme vacancy or a boom economy or, you know, very, very different model of the split between living and working and so on. So if you imagine all those changes and imagine that we don't know how or when those changes will happen, right? I wonder if this idea of having like your insanely great refuge in this porous tower might also reference like strange vacancy or like under occupation and start to turn a down economy into something actually quite lovely.
When we think of SCI-Arc's research department, we often think of our external partners, the foundations, governmental entities, and corporations that sponsor or help us pay for the work that we do. But within the campus, we can also say the research department is a handful of professional researchers who work together to make this stuff happen. But every project also includes faculty members and, to the greatest degree possible, the students who can both work on the project as student employees, as research assistants, but also sponsoring of courses and a real impact on the curriculum, so that the kind of work that we try to do in the world is work that the students learn how to do by the time that they leave as well.